A cry for patriotism, the Boston Massacre. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. John Adams, a Patriot lawyer, 1770. On March 5, 1770, the British soldiers who were stationed in Boston, Massachusetts, fired at a mob of angry American colonists. On this day, 5 deaths occurred, and today we know this event as the Boston Massacre. 8 British soldiers were brought to court, yet no one wanted to represent them because of what they had done. Did these soldiers even have the right to a fair trial? Who would take responsibility? Long before the Boston Massacre, there was the French and Indian War. This was a colonial war that took place because France and Britain both had fought hard for the colonies in America. Each country strived to have the largest amount of area in the Americas. The conflict, you ask? Both France and Great Britain wanted their own territory. The Native Americans were involved in this too. They found themselves in different groups fighting for both sides. Britain came out on top with a huge amount of land. Yet, they fell into debt and they began to put taxes on the American colonies. Britain did not want to argue with France anymore, and this resulted in the Proclamation of 1763. The Proclamation of 1763 was an agreement among the British Parliament and King George III. It was to be said that the American colonists were forbidden to move west into the Appalachian Mountains. Saving conflict between the Native Americans and colonists caused struggle between the colonies and Britain. Did the British Parliament even have the right to forbid them from their very own land? Tempers continuing to rise in 1764, the British Parliament passed the first tax on the American colonists. This act was called the Sugar Act. This meant that the colonists had to pay taxes for everyday items. Even though Britain was suffering, the colonists believed in protesting the Sugar Act. In the end, the Sugar Act eventually became reduced by the government of Britain, yet that did not stop them from the act they put into place in 1765, only causing more tension. In 1765, the Stamp Act was put into place, causing American colonists to pay for a stamp on all paper goods such as certificates, newspapers, playing cards, and more. It resulted in very angered American colonists. What was the point of paying taxes on things they used every day? The American colonists believed it was unfair, and this resulted in taxation without representation in 1765. The taxation without representation explains the main reason why many American colonists were very angry. They had no one to voice their opinion in the British Parliament. The American colonists were expected to understand why everything was causing taxes. After all, the French and Indian War caused a large amount of debt for Britain. Although many knew about the debt, they believed strongly about being able to be involved within the British Parliament. More and more piled on, and the angrier they became. The Quartering Act of 1765, which was an act that asked colonists to host soldiers in their own home, and they had to provide as much as they could, and the Townshend Act of 1767, that put taxes on things like paint, glass, and tea, were the last 2 acts put into place, causing extreme tension. The tension became noticed, causing conflict and chaos that soon was reflected in the Boston Massacre. Although so much chaos arose, the British soldiers arrived and settled themselves in Boston, Massachusetts in 1768. If the public are bound to yield obedience laws to which they cannot give their approbation, they are slaves to those to make such laws and enforce them. Samuel Adams, member of the Sons of Liberty, 1772. March 5, 1770. Today, we know it as the Boston Massacre. Massacre, they called it. What is a massacre? According to the definition, it is the act or instance of killing a large number of humans indiscriminately and cruelly. Scenes of an event like this could be passing through your mind. Well, the Boston Massacre does not fit that definition. It was a chilly winter night in Boston, Massachusetts, on King Street. The British soldiers made their rounds, and little did they know, soon they would lose their very own power. An argument was all it took, separating the British soldiers from their controls. What happened that day? An argument broke out between Hugh Montgomery, a British soldier, and an American colonist. Snowballs were thrown at soldiers, and soon an angry mob formed. Fighting and arguing grew louder and louder, all until a club was thrown at Private Hugh Montgomery. During all of the confusion, words were shouted, "Fire and be damned!" from the American colonists. Captain Thomas Preston, a British soldier, ordered for the others not to fire at unarmed colonists. Yet, they did not listen. Shots were fired, and before anyone knew it, 3 colonists had died on the scene. 2 others later on. A citizen by the name of Benjamin Burdick walked up to Captain Thomas Preston and explained, I want to see the faces I may swear to another day. His response, "Perhaps, sir, you may." Captain Thomas Preston knew right then the court would be expecting an appearance. On this day, only 5 people were killed, every one of them an American colonist. One by the name of Crispus Attucks, a runaway slave. He is known as one of the first men to die for his country. So if only 5 men were killed, then how is it a massacre? The Sons of Liberty were the creators of the idea of a massacre. Paul Revere's engraving is what it was called. The Sons of Liberty was an underground resistance organization that was made up of men from the New England colonies that protested the acts of the British Parliament. Some of the members of this organization were Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. They relied on public displays, such as posters, to get support on their position against the British government. Paul Revere's famous engraving described the event as a one-sided shooting. Right from the start, the engraving is all wrong. A blue sky shows the event during the day, although it was during the bitter cold night. Only a moon in the corner of the engraving shows the true story of the massacre. Then there is the alignment of British soldiers. It is shown that the soldiers are lined up, facing their rifles at the American colonists that were coming off to be quite calm. Yet, we know that's not the story. And above all, it displays Crispus Attucks lying on the ground, dead, yet his skin color is white. Why was it all wrong, do you wonder? Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty needed help portraying that the British soldiers did not belong in the Americas. Today it is argued that Paul Revere's engraving is one of the most famous engravings in the world. His engraving became the most powerful influence in forming an outspoken anti-British public opinion. John Adams was the savior of the trial. He took responsibility of representing the British soldiers. Although himself being British and having his own beliefs, he provided them the right to a fair trial. He disagreed with the presence of British soldiers in colonies, and he no longer wanted to be British. Although, John Adams also recognized the law and knew that the right to a fair trial was a part of the British Bill of Rights. The determination within John Adams was noticed. He wrote in his very own journal about how he was risking his life, giving them a chance, constantly knowing that if this did not happen, the U.S. would not be the same. During the trial, John Adams carefully presented his information. 8 British soldiers were brought to court, only to find 2 guilty, Kilroy and Montgomery. John Adams found himself very successful, carrying himself well. The trial was very different than what was expected. This was the first time a judge had ever said reasonable doubt and used the benefit of clergy. This meaning Kilroy and Montgomery, the 2 soldiers that had fired into the crowd, escaped death by praying the benefit of clergy. They had to prove that they deserved this by reading the Psalm 51. They did not die, although they did get an M, meaning murder, and they would never again receive the benefit of clergy. Samuel Adams, cousin of John Adams, was a consistent writer throughout the entire trial. He described the soldiers as escaping with blood on their hands. After all, they were set free from the sentence of death. Although so much happened from 1770 to 1772, things passed by very quietly between the British colonists and American colonists. The American colonists started to resist by boycotting or not buying British goods. In 1773, colonists demonstrated frustration by dressing up like Indians and sneaking onto ships in the harbor. From there, they would dump tea into the water. This was called the Boston Tea Party. The British then took to action and closed the port in Boston. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met and created a list of many complaints about the British, only angering colonists more. In 1775, a group of colonists fought against the British Army in the battles of Lexington and Concord. Then there was a Second Continental Congress, which decided to create the Continental Army. This army involved citizens of the 13 colonies, and they were ready to fight for their rights. Although a small footprint in history, the impacts of the Boston Massacre have changed America into what it has become today. Without the rallying cry for patriotism that came as a result of this event, we would not be where we are today. Also, we might be a different country if John Adams, Samuel Adams, and even Captain Thomas Preston hadn't taken on responsibilities for others. The right the British had to a fair trial gave and helped preserve reasoning in America, which showed that we are a fair society. Without the results of the Boston Massacre, we would not have created the Continental Army, which has protected us in many ways. The Boston Massacre was just the beginning of the American Revolution, which is what shaped us into what we are today. Also, we would not have our U.S. Constitution Bill of Rights. Our Sixth Amendment explains how everyone has the right to a fair trial. Whenever we look back on history, we often wonder why everything happened the way it did. But look around and understand how far we have come. How one person can take on a responsibility and change the whole outlook on America. And how one right can be changed into a second chance for someone who has made a mistake.